Well, good afternoon, everybody. And let's just check how many Massachusetts people there are here. Are there any? Hands up if you are. One. We were hoping to see more of you, but it's nice to see you. Well, welcome and thank you very much. Rachel Clarke is a quite unusual individual in that I think, I haven't researched this, but I'm pretty sure that she's the only person who's ever got a first in English at Oxford University and then followed it 10 years later with a first in medicine. So she knows her onions and how to spell them. And the other thing which is interesting in just observing this audience is how human beings arrange themselves. Some want to be as far away from the speakers as possible. Some want to be as near the speakers as possible and as far away from any other human being in the hall. And then there are clusters of people who want to sit in 4s and 5s. It's all very, very interesting, and I think they're worth another global study, the psychology of audiences. Rachel and I are going to talk about inequality and health and access to health. Rachel and I, despite our age disparity, have worked closely together in the past. She produced a major documentary with me. I was the presenter of it, and she was the producer.
You were the eye candy.
It was called The Sick List, and it took us very close to the coalface of the state of the NHS at that time. Little did I know at that stage that Rachel herself would actually be at the coalface the next time I encountered her in front of a large audience. And here she is. A most extraordinary thing to have spent 10 years as a documentary maker and then cross the divide and end up as an extremely influential force in the NHS and in medicine. She's a caring and wonderful doctor on top of being an extremely political animal. Is that fair?
I think so.
Right.
I think so.
Well, first of all, I think it's worth asking, what on earth made you give up a good job in media to become a doctor?
So it's interesting because I think I see, in a strange way, filmmaking, my old job, as on a continuum with what I do today as a doctor. So in a sense, they couldn't be more different. I'm looking after patients, trying to help them through their ill health now. But actually, it's the same motivation for both careers. I went into television journalism and made films precisely because, in a very simple, straightforward way, I wanted to do my little bit to try and make the world a better place. And through the power of television, you can, of course, reach out to a huge audience and maybe try and influence things for the better through the simple but incredibly potent force of individual stories, giving those stories a platform, and if they are stories that are not often heard because they're from people who are marginalised in society, people who don't normally have very much power or wealth or status in society, then you can really do something in a tiny, weeny way to try and make the world a better place. And, I'm not embarrassed to say that was always, in the broadest sense, what I wanted to try and do with my life. I wanted to do something good with my life. But actually, I found, as someone who came from a medical family and had lots of doctors and nurses in my family, much as I loved making films, that was really ingrained in me, and my dad especially was a real driving force in my life. He was an NHS doctor his whole life long, and we used to discuss his patients in sickening detail over the dinner table to the disgust of my family. And all the way through my years as a journalist, I had this nagging feeling that perhaps I was doing the wrong thing, and really what I wanted to do was not so much tell other people's stories, but roll up my sleeves and get involved on a kind of day-to-day basis with patients and try and help improve their lives in a much more hands-on way. But it was the same motivation throughout. I found that you have much less power as an individual doctor, you don't have a platform, you can't reach 1 million people with your film that's just been broadcast on Channel 4, for example, but you have something else. You have this everyday, daily interaction with patients that enabled me to just be the human being I want to be. I want to be humane, I want to be caring, I want to try and help people every day in this hands-on way as a doctor, and suddenly I found I was able to do that in a hugely fulfilling way. And I guess through the last couple of years, getting involved in domestic health politics and getting into dispute with the government over the junior doctor contract and standing up for NHS underfunding and understaffing and all those things that I feel very passionately are to the detriment of health and patient safety in Britain. That's a fantastic way of combining both those aspects of my careers, the sort of hands-on looking after patients with trying to have a wider platform to do good.
Now, obviously, we're in a very controversial time with the NHS. It's a unique service anywhere in the world. It's the most amazingly comprehensive and holistic system, but it's being attacked very dramatically, partly by the private sector's encroachment into having to make up the holes in the service, and partly by lack of funding. But I would turn to you and say, gosh, you know, if you remember the immediate period after Mrs. Thatcher, things were much worse.
So much worse, and we're both old enough to remember that firsthand. So
what are you moaning about now?
Absolutely. So John and I, when we made this Channel 4 documentary, The Sick List, which was a good decade ago now, this was the time when the Thatcher legacy of NHS underfunding had really cut into what the NHS was capable of providing. And I remember we went off and interviewed a man probably in his 50s in Wales who had had a heart attack, had coronary arteries that were filled with cholesterol, was on a waiting list for heart surgery, and had been on that waiting list for 18 months. And literally every time he got chest pain, which he did every day, he was terrified he was going to die from another heart attack. And he was right to be terrified because statistically he was very, very likely to have another heart attack. I remember him weeping when you interviewed him, this sort of tough, gruff ex-miner, because he was so frightened of dying on an NHS waiting list for essential, urgent emergency surgery, and he'd been on that waiting list for 18 months. So, and today, you know, he would be whisked into an A&E and he would get his treatment the same day in most British hospitals. So you compare now to 10 years ago, and we have come such a fantastically long way. But in a sense, I think that also shows the precariousness of NHS provision at any one point. So if 10 years ago, as a result of underfunding, that could have been the scale of waiting list that patients were enduring and the loss of life that patients were enduring, avoidable unnecessary deaths, it says something very important about the point at which we're at now. So many doctors and healthcare professionals now feel as though we're at this pivotal point where the health service since 2010 has had a running down of its budget year on year, the like of which we've never seen since 1948 when the NHS was first set up. And all of us are screaming from the rooftops that if this carries on, we are going to return to those bad old days. We're going to see patients who die unnecessarily. We saw that happen last winter. We had patients literally dying on trolleys in hospital corridors. The last time that happened was absolutely back then a decade ago during the Tory underfunded years under Thatcher. And we're at that point potentially now. So in one sense, haven't we moved a long way? How wonderful that our ability to provide healthcare to all is so much better than it was a decade ago. But how desperately poignant and sad if this is a high point and it's being eroded steadily by underfunding.
Of course, the sickest aspect, perhaps, of Brexit is that the figure on the bus the 350 million a week, is probably what experts believe the NHS actually needs. So what could have been sicker, really, than to put a sign like that on a bus when you therefore recognised that was the amount of money that was needed, but knew full well it would never, ever be accorded?
I mean, it's pretty remarkable, isn't it, as an example of political cynicism, to tap into the fact that you know the vast majority of the British public love their NHS. They might not think it's perfect, but they believe fundamentally in this institution that exists to provide equality in British society, to give an equal standard of healthcare to all, regardless of their power or wealth. The cynicism of tapping into that and pretending that somehow via Brexit we are going to give that money to the NHS while knowing full well that nothing like that is ever going to occur.
Would that be enough?
So all the health think tanks have estimated that next year, the 2018 to 19, the NHS needs around £4 billion more than it gets. So at the moment, the NHS budget is about £130 billion a year.
Does that include the budget or not? The uplift of 2.4?
So the amount that everybody felt we needed was in the order of 4 billion, and Philip Hammond gave a bit less than half of that in the budget. So it's something, but it's by no means enough. And that 4 billion isn't anything like enough to redress the 7 years of underfunding that we've seen. It's a bare minimum to sort of keep afloat.
Take us to your hospital. How often do you actually see something which says to you, underfunding?
This is the really tragic thing, because I would answer that question with no exaggeration by saying every single day. And I imagine there are other frontline staff in the audience. That's one of the hardest things when you want to be doing a good job and you are unable to because the resources aren't there. So I work in a specialist palliative care ward, and we're meant to have 18 beds on our ward, and we cover the whole of Oxfordshire. So the patients I treat are not only at the end of life, they're often dying of cancer, for example. They are the patients with really difficult symptoms that require specialist input, so terrible, complicated pain, all kinds of other symptoms, and we need to sweep them up to try and give them some kind of dignity and quality at the end of life. We're meant to have 18 beds. At the moment, on Monday, in fact, our unit is going to go down to 12 beds. It's already down to 14 and it's going down to 12. None of us want that to happen, but the money isn't there, the nurses aren't there, we can't keep our beds open. So that means at any point in Oxfordshire, there are 6 patients who desperately need to come in. Our beds are always oversubscribed and they can't get in because the resources just aren't there. And to give another example, and this is not my own direct experience, but it is a colleague of mine from a different area, but who told me this story recently. In January of this year, so the last winter crisis, and we're now heading into this year's winter crisis, she was asked to escort a patient from the accident and emergency unit to go up several floors to a ward, and she was told, go right away, this patient has to leave the department. And the urgency was required because there were ambulances stacked up outside the hospital, everyone filled with a patient. There were patients lining the corridors, they were in offices, they were in the hospital gym, and this patient was deemed to be fit enough to leave A&E so that somebody else could get in. She escorted the patient up in the lift, and as they set off, herself, the patient, and a porter, the patient literally died in transit in the lift, being treated more like a FedEx parcel than a human being. And that happened because the hospital she worked in was in such desperate crisis. They were feverishly trying to move patients because the whole thing was in a state of absolute stasis. No one could get in and out of the department. And to my mind, that example is really totemic of where healthcare is at in British society today. The NHS is meant to be a world-class, excellent health service. if we are treating patients who are dying like FedEx parcels and letting them die in lifts rather than giving them humane, decent care, then something profoundly has gone wrong, and it's beholden on our government to be honest and open and candid about that, because if we're not those things, how do you ever improve?
But our NHS is not simply a hospital system. I mean, it's a much more holistic system than that. Is it crumbling at other parts? I mean, you get the feeling that the health service is having to deal with far more than just health. That in fact they're dealing with inequality, homelessness, sleeping rough, family breakdown, divorce. I mean, can you see a way in which perhaps if society developed a more holistic mode of assistance to people in need, be it fully a matter of health, or be it really in the end a matter of social underpinning?
I think that's such a good point, and so often the NHS scoops up people on the margins who are being failed in so many other ways, and of course it's exceptionally difficult for the health service to carry out that role when really maybe they're also working as social services, an education system, all these other things that are also threadbare.
Well, not to mention the housing crisis.
Absolutely.
I mean, a shortage of 1 million houses, which is what we're told we have, must have health consequences.
Yes.
Must have health consequences. And then it's the NHS that has to pick them up.
Absolutely. So the question is, what do we do about that? Because in a sense, you're, I think, talking about fundamental, wider social inequality, aren't you?
Well, I am, but at the same time, I'm also thinking you can go on swelling the budget of the NHS forever in an attempt, perhaps, to blur the reality that actually what you really need is money further down the system in the way that people actually live their day-to-day lives.
Yes, yes. I mean, maybe this is very simplistic, but in a sense, it seems to me as though the logical endpoint of what you're saying is we need more redistribution of wealth in British society, because those inequalities writ large, how are they going to be addressed in any other way? And, you know, we've been through 7-8 years of post-banking crisis austerity Britain, and certainly on the front line of the health service, I see the effects of that at work in terms of people coming in who are homeless, who are living in housing where I saw a patient last week who literally couldn't afford any central heating.
Well, one hopes that people will look back on the banking crisis and say, now, hang on a minute, how did they resolve it? Oh, I see. What they did was to bring in austerity for the poorest people in the country, basically. I mean, that's the people who have actually had no pay rise, whatever, benefits cuts and the rest of it, are people actually at the lower end of society. But who were they? Why was this happening? Oh, because actually the people who had a great deal of money screwed up, messed around with the banks and the rest of it, and caused a major crisis in which the rest of the country would have sunk unless the poor had come forward and, well, they didn't come forward, they were put forward to carry the burden of paying it off.
Completely.
Well, I mean, that is a very difficult situation, isn't it? And one which, again, will put the health service in the front line. You could argue that the front line of the banking crisis was actually the NHS.
Yes.
No, you could.
Yeah. I think that's very true. And I suppose I would say, therefore, if you accept the truth of that argument, it means that NHS front line is absolutely critical in our society today as a stalwart against all of the deprivation that has arisen in post-austerity Britain.
Well, therefore, there is possibly a way of looking at it and saying, actually, NHS activists are so effective that the budget has been kept going at a pretty good level whilst everything else has been pared down to I mean, there were some terrible figures the other day about the cuts in local authority funding, 40% down in the last 25 years. Now, cuts in local authority funding, you might mean perhaps the salaries of the chief executive. Actually, not in this case. This is actually the reduction of housing, of social care, of all sorts of elements of a welfare state. And so long as you leave the golden sort of obelisk standing proud, you're going to be all right because they won't notice that all these other things have been cut. So isn't there a danger you've been rather too effective?
Well, I think everyone I know in the NHS works really hard above and beyond because we went into it to try and help people who are sick. We didn't go into it to get rich. We wanted to look after people. So, and most people in the NHS work very, very hard to that end. I think it's impossible.
In pursuing that argument, we could argue that you are doing a very good job of dealing with people who are sick, but you're not telling society enough about the people who are not sick, who are coming to you for aid.
Yes.
And that costs money.
So I would argue something slightly different. I would argue that many frontline staff in the NHS are trying to speak out about all of those things, but it's very, very difficult to speak out in a way that is heard when it tends to be the government who is able via their Department of Health or other department press offices to influence and manipulate the way in which mainstream media reports health and social issues, and especially the issues of social inequality. Well,
there, of course, we come to a very awkward and embarrassing fact for me, which is that if you look at the media is not representative of the society that it serves and not representative of the society to whom it transmits and about whom it transmits.
So let me ask you a question, John. So I know you care about inequality, but how can you argue that you are committed to reducing inequality in British society
when I'm a posh sod?
When you're a posh sod and quite a rich one as well.
Yeah, well...
I'd say that tie probably cost more than, maybe an average weekly budget.
Well, I'm not going to go there, but I would say this, that I certainly was born the right side of the blanket. I mean, I grew up in an upper middle class family, but because I was a bit thick, which was a problem because I only got very limited O-levels and A-levels, I decided to go on VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas, in order to try and tempt a university into taking me for other reasons than my examinations. And that exposed me to a situation in which I was in a community that was 30 miles from the nearest telephone and to the nearest post box, and we had one nurse looking after the area the size of Oxfordshire, more or less. I mean, a really very large area, and no doctors at all. You'd have to go to Kampala or Jinja to get. This was in Uganda, looking north from the south was a completely massive experience because I was with kids. I had 70 kids in my class, and they had nothing, except that they were as bright as any kids I'd ever met. No books. I had to copy an enormous amount of stuff out for them to have any access to the written word. And that certainly talked to me about inequality and unjustifiable inequality, looking north from the south. And then the other thing was that because I'd been politicized by this, I got thrown out of university when I got there, because I got tied up in the campaign to liberate Nelson Mandela. I found the university was investing in South African companies, and that seemed a little wrong. But they thought we were wrong, so we were thrown out. But so I had to go and work in a day centre for homeless and vulnerable kids, and that really drove home the state of inequality. So to some extent, I have some awareness of it, but I don't live it, that is true. But I have to tell you that Grenfell Tower was the most grievous manifestation of inequality, and despite all the war and pestilence that I've ever reported, was by far the most shattering experience in our town, in our time, to our people. absolutely appalling, and in the richest borough in Britain.
Yeah.
Inexcusable, utterly inexcusable. And it brings us right back to the health service, because what in fact you see in Kensington, Chelsea, and in many other boroughs and local authorities is that responsibility, direct responsibility for the welfare of people that you are being paid to look after, is actually being offloaded to a private enterprise company which has no interest whatever in the welfare of the people, and only an interest in making a profit in the contract that they have to manage it. And that is if you're in America, and I'd like to talk to the girls and boys from Massachusetts, but you can lend them the message, but if in America they had a welfare state, you wouldn't endure the inequality and pain that you suffer. And we are watching our own welfare state be eroded. You're concerned with the health aspect. It's massive. It's a very big element of it. But I believe that the whole issue of the welfare state, within which the health service is the most important and structural part, is under siege. And that if in fact one separates one section from another without educating government into understanding that if you detach bits of social responsibility from the core, then you will rob the health service rotten, because they can't cope with the consequences of eroding what should be happening elsewhere in the community.
Yeah, completely agree.
Lecture over.
And I think there's another interesting parallel between what happened to the residents of Grenfell Tower and what is happening today in the NHS, and that is, in both instances, individuals were and still are trying to speak out, but their voices are being silenced. So we know that Grenfell residents over and over again were warning of the dangers of their urban environment, and those warnings were being dismissed and denied. And in a sense, many of us working on the NHS frontline today, we feel as though a similar thing is happening. Staff are trying to speak out and say, look, if things carry on as they are, then patients are going to be endangered. Patients are being endangered now. We've already been through one terrible scandal in the health service, the Mid Staffordshire scandal, where we know thousands of patients were mistreated, in large part because that particular trust chose to try and save millions of pounds by cutting its budget, by cutting staff. And once the staff were cut, the remaining nurses and doctors were unable to give a decent quality standard of care to patients. So many of us are making the same argument now. We're saying, look, Britain is short, England rather, is short of 40,000 nurses at the moment. We're short of at least 6,000 doctors. The staff who are left cannot keep people safe. People are going to die on our watch. And in a sense, the NHS now feels like the government's next Grenfell. It is the next disaster waiting to happen, but they will not hear that.
What is the role of private care?
So it is so much bigger than I would like it to be. So we know that ever since the Health and Social Care Act came into force in 2012, private companies can now competitively tender for NHS contracts. We know that Virgin is one of the prime beneficiaries of that process. So Virgin owns and runs, for example, all of community paediatrics in Wiltshire, where my family's from, and in other parts of the country. And in fact, we know from this week that Virgin, after they failed to secure another lucrative NHS contract, have just received in the order of at least £300,000 of compensation after suing the NHS for not getting another big lucrative NHS contract. So we're already in a world where, yes, the NHS is still funded by British taxpayers, but no, NHS activity is not any longer exclusively provided by NHS staff. It is in part provided by private companies. And you could argue that that could, on occasion, be beneficial. I think it's right not to be too dogmatic, and we should always be guided by who is best at delivering a service for patients. But intrinsically, one feels if a private company like Virgin gets involved, Richard Branson's not doing it out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing it to make money. And once you have a private company whose motive is profit, you've got a very different order of relationship with patients than you have with NHS staff. So for me, a patient is not a commodity, it's not an opportunity to get rich, it's someone I want to help, and that's why I'm there in the health service.
Is it a truism that, in fact, if you get really ill in the private sector, you're better to go back into the NHS, and indeed you are put back into the NHS when the going gets too hard?
Yes, absolutely. If anybody here is intending to become unwell in a private hospital, I would strongly recommend getting out of there as quickly as possible. So the most private hospitals don't have intensive care units, for example. They don't have an anaesthetist on site. So if something happens and you need to be intubated...
But to what extent does the NHS then charge the private hospital for the service they're now having to provide, given that the hospital sets itself out to deal with a cancer that they can't in the end deal with and have to put into the public sector?
Not in the slightest, nope.
Why not?
So, why indeed? So this is one of the huge concerns that many of us have. It's the cherry picking of the simple, quick, fast turnover, bulk activity that enables you to make a huge amount of money quickly. So, for example, private companies that will churn through cataract operations around the clock or hip and knee replacements, that's absolutely fantastic for making money. But the moment one of those patients suffers a complication, so their hip replacement becomes infected and suddenly this patient crashes in septic shock, they'll rush to an NHS, A&E, an intensive care, and possibly have tens of thousands of pounds worth of treatment spent on them, and that will all be at the taxpayer's expense. None of that will ever be recouped from the private company. So this cherry picking of lucrative contracts, which is really running apace at the moment, is very, very worrying, because it means that, in a sense, at the moment, it looks like all the elective, lucrative activity, not all of it, but a lot of it is being outsourced, leaving a kind of rump emergency service of the non-cost-effective, non-money-making parts of healthcare, so emergency care, mental health provision, maternity, as you don't make that much money in maternity with complications. All of that is becoming an NHS rump, and increasingly the rest is being outsourced.
But there's no evidence that the state is concerned about that.
By the government?
Yeah.
You know, many people think the opposite. They think that, you know, there are obviously this government, there are many members of the cabinet who have an ideological commitment to shrinking the size of the state, and so they see outsourcing healthcare to private companies as part of the invisible hand at work. This is competition driving up standards, and it's for the good of everybody. It will make everything more efficient. But from my experience as a frontline doctor, efficiency is a very dangerous concept in the delivery of healthcare. It's obviously important. Nobody wants to waste money, but the problem with efficiency as a value is it tends to only count the things that can be quantified. So if you can't add it up, does it exist in the NHS? If I spend an hour holding a patient who is terrified because they're dying, and I calm them down and I talk to their family and we discuss what might happen, and then perhaps they reach a peace and resolution at this point in their life that really helps all of them, and the family live on with a better legacy of the death of their loved one, that might all be terribly important and valuable. It doesn't exist on a spreadsheet. It's nowhere in an efficiency metric. It can't be counted. So competition and efficiency, they're all fine and good as aspirations in healthcare, but there's a real danger that they eclipse so much of what we as professionals provide, which is care. By definition, that's human, it's nebulous, it can't be chopped up into beans.
I want to open it up to the conference in a moment, but I just want to ask you, you're 3 years into a fully fledged doctor?
No, I'm now 7.
7.
So I'm in my 8th year.
How time flies.
Absolutely.
But tell me, this journey from qualifying to this moment now, in your book, you describe, I mean, extraordinarily personally dangerous situations in which you, with very little knowledge, are confronted with I mean, there's some triumphant moments. There's the moment you find a vein in the thumb of a drug addict who swore you wouldn't be able to find a vein anywhere that would do anything, and you
said he'd give me a gram of heroin if I did.
Yes. But I mean, the other sorts of things are at the sort of tender first few months, being confronted by people bleeding heavily on a trolley, not really knowing quite what it is and the rest of it. You're thrown in the deep end.
Yeah, you really are. And you come out of medical school and suddenly, day one, there you are carrying an on-call bleep and you're looking after patients, and you think to yourself, my God, someone's made a hideous and horrible mistake here. They actually think I can keep someone safe, and I can't. I don't know what I'm doing. But all of those baptisms of fire, they're the things that make you as a doctor. And although they're terrifying, and although it's really tough, it is the most extraordinary, fulfilling, wonderful job I could ever imagine, because with all your science and all your humanity, you mix that all together and you help people. And it's this sort of interesting combination of, on the one hand, trying to be a people person, listening to people, caring about what matters to them, and at the same time being really scientific and technical. Have you got the skill to get a needle into this patient's spine or whatever it might be? And it's extraordinary to use all those skills.
So there's never been an occasion when you've said, forget this, get me a camera, I'll go off and...
Well, sometimes I wish I could be making a documentary again. I think it's fair to say there's been quite a lot of news in 2017, really. There's been a few things happening in the world, and I think whenever there's a big story, my inner journalist hasn't quite died, and I always instinctively think, I want to get out there, I want to be telling this story. But I have found, no matter how exciting it is telling someone else's story, actually, genuinely, what really makes me tick and what I really love is hearing the individual stories of my patients. And maybe this is a really important and profound point about film and the power of narrative for all of us. I think in telling an individual story, especially if it's somebody's story who doesn't normally have a voice, they don't have a platform to be heard, you can do something absolutely remarkable and extraordinary. And anyone who is involved in documenting health inequality or health problems has the potential to give voice to people who normally are never heard. And I think that's an extraordinary thing to do.
Well, basically we have illustrated the welfare state under siege, the natural consequence being that the health service tends to have to pick up the pieces and isn't funded to do so. And you've heard some of the sort of personal insights of Rachel. So I don't know if anybody has any points they'd like to come in with, or anybody wants to raise any points, but we're here, and there are a couple of microphones here, and a couple of people are going to hand them around. So does anybody have any point that they would like to raise? Yes, in the green, or it looks green in this light, but it's probably brown, jacket. Just put your hand up so they know how to find you. Just put, that's it. Do you see him? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to hear from the speakers on the stage, but I'd also like to hear from the audience. I think we'd all agree that the health service is struggling to cope despite the incredible efforts of people like Rachel. What can we actually do about it? My perspective is that of someone who's been a trade union activist most of his working life, and I work in the civil service. I cannot recall it, and I would normally be expecting trade unions to lead a lot of the fight against the breakup of the health service. But I can't recall a time when the trade unions were weaker than they are now. So unfortunately, I'm rather pessimistic. Of course, we're all praying for a different government. But I can see things getting worse before then. So what can we do in the next few years to stop the breakup of the health service and turn it round?
That's a rather big question.
I am not wholly pessimistic in spite of everything. I think we're at a very, very dark time at the moment, but I think that we all have the capacity to do something, and it might sound small, but I don't think it is. I think it's absolutely huge. We all have a voice. The only point at which we no longer have a voice is if we choose to stay silent, and we can all speak out. There are 1.6 million people who work in the NHS. Every single one of us has a voice, and every single person in British society has a voice as well. I think that social media has been castigated for helping bring people like Donald Trump into power. And to some degree, obviously, I sympathise with that argument. But at the same time, I think social media is a profoundly democratising force in society, because anybody has a platform, anybody has a voice. And sometimes what happens on social media will influence mainstream media, and it will make the mainstream headlines. All of us can tell the truth about what we see around us every day. I try and do it about the health service, and sometimes I'm very, very worried about what the repercussions of that might be for my job. But I'm going to keep on doing it because I believe that my duty as a doctor, my first duty as a doctor, is to act in the best interests of my patients. And I believe that that takes place not only with the patient in front of me, but much more widely in speaking out against the forces that are making it harder for the NHS to keep patients safe in an underfunded NHS that we inhabit today. We can all speak out, and even if we're not doing it on television, we're not doing it in a newspaper, we're only speaking out to our neighbour, we can keep telling the truth. And the moment we give up speaking out, all hope is lost. Then they've won, the sort of nebulous they on the other side have won. We can keep doing that. Everybody can write a letter to their MP tonight. Everybody can ask their friends to write letters to their MPs. In the end, the reason this government is able to do what it has done to the NHS for the last 7 years, essentially, is because the British population is allowing that to happen. We can all say something and do something tiny, and maybe incrementally, if everybody did something tiny, we could make that stop. And we've got to keep trying. If we love the NHS, we can't give up, I would say.
Up there and then down here.
Can I just respond to what you said? Because people are ambivalent about the NHS because their own personal experiences have been so bad. I mean, I love the NHS, you know, I fight for it, but my own personal experience of going to the GP with a problem, going to a hospital, having biopsies lost and bits of paper going to the wrong GP, make it very hard for us, the British public, to be as passionate as you are.
Yeah.
Well, I'd just like to say one thing, and I think it honestly is what is so awful about this is that it depends a bit where you live. You know, I mean, I happen to live in central London, and I have access to University College Hospital, which is, I think, possibly the greatest hospital in the world. I mean, you know, you get an appointment very fast. You get seen on the day they say you'll see you. At the time they'll see you. Actually, at the time. I don't know how they do it. It can be done. But of course, the people in that area are well heeled. The taxes are levied and the rest of it. But obviously there are parts of the country where the service is absolutely awful. Partly, I think, still because it's overburdened with stuff that the health service shouldn't be having to deal with. But because the local authorities have not enough social workers, not enough social support, their time and energy and everything else is drained away by these problems that they're not really set up to deal with.
Yeah.
But I understand from some people in the health service that computerization and all the rest of it has not actually gone terribly well.
No.
And that is a critical thing. I mean, it's clear. I mean, if your biopsies and the rest of it are going off to the wrong places and ending up, they shouldn't be on bits of paper at all. They should be in a absolutely fail-safe computer system where anybody, anywhere in the health service can access it and say, Mr. X blogs has got this, and off you go.
Yeah.
So it's alarming that any of your stuff is still on paper.
And you know, I would never pretend the NHS is perfect. It's very, very far from it, and it can absolutely be improved. And I don't think there is a sort of binary either-or dichotomy between either the NHS requires more money and more money alone to get better, or it must just be more efficient. It doesn't need more money, it just needs to improve in terms of efficiency. It's both. It needs more money and it needs to be reformed and made more efficient internally as well. But I think it's extremely difficult to improve a health service when it's always firefighting, it's always scrabbling at the edges, the margins of what it's capable of, because demand is outstripping supply, because the budget has been run down. But I absolutely agree with you that there are many ways in which the NHS could be improved and should be improved, and so much for the better if that happens.
Microphone coming to you.
Thank you. My question is a little bit more specialised because I'm chairman of a charity that specialises in ME and chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and so on. And also I personally suffered from this appalling illness for 3 years, and luckily I was one of the very few who recovered fully. My question is this. Can you offer, with such a complex and such an appalling illness that destroys so many lives and for which there is no effective cure or treatment yet, can you offer any hope at all into the potential of even getting to a comprehensive research strategy into biomedical causes, let alone to effective treatments?
So I think, as someone who's not an expert on ME, I wouldn't want to pretend that I can speak with authority in answering that question, because it's just not my area of expertise. I think that from everything I have read, clearly there are many patients who suffer from chronic fatigue syndrome who feel very, very let down by what the health service provides them with. And I think the absence of maybe adequate research into the biomedical causes of the condition is a part of that, because in the absence of that, I have read lots of pieces about the fact that doctors in the NHS just assume this isn't a real illness. It's just it's just sufferers malingering or not being able to cope with life, and all of those sort of pejorative descriptions of patients who have chronic fatigue syndrome. I don't know enough about the area to know what is needed, but it's clearly one of those areas where more is needed. As that's not a very helpful argument, but I think it's an important point to raise.
Thank you.
I just for one penny's worth, I cannot think that leaving the European Union will assist in any of the research projects that are currently underway, but I may be wrong. Maybe it'll be a very fertile consequence of leaving.
Well, David Davis did say this week, when asked in the Select Committee if Brexit was going to have any was going to cause the nursing understaffing crisis to worsen in the NHS, he simply said no. In the absence of impact assessments.
And what was the drop in European take-up of nursing? It's a huge...
This year, 96%.
96%, yeah. Anything else? Yes, ma'am. Here, in the middle here.
Hello, I'm Aisha. I'm a graduate medical student, but I'm actually studying in Warsaw in Poland. Yeah. I wanted to ask, it's a bit more of like a medically question, but when I was doing an A&E placement here in the UK over summer, I spoke to a lot of doctors, well, F1, F2s, and a lot of them were saying that either they're going to leave or they're going to probably only work like part-time or locuming and like kind of more go into the GP side. Like pretty much everyone I spoke to like said that. And even like the consultants would like discourage, because I'm really interested in it, they were discouraging me of like, really think about this before you want to get into this, right? And also, a lot of the students that I'm with, everyone is international where I study, and a lot of us that were from the UK, or even other people from other parts of the world thinking about coming to the UK, like obviously now because of Brexit, they're really, really reconsidering that choice. I mean, like even I was like, okay, maybe I should go to America instead, but then Trump happened and I was like, oh, fuck it, I guess. Like, I'm gonna have to come back to the UK and, you know, like
And I
come
wouldn't
back.
go home to Poland either. I mean, you've
Oh
got that
no,
problem
if you
too.
came to the hospitals there, like seriously, when I came here and I heard everyone complain, I was like, come to Poland, you haven't seen anything yet. But yeah, like I just wanted to ask you, like, you know, like what can you say for me when I try and convince my other students or anyone else, like stay, carry on, like be more invested, like is there any advice you have that I can like say to my fellow colleagues?
So it's interesting, the thing about people getting to the end of their foundation training, so after the first 2 years, it used to be the case that the vast majority of doctors just carried on in NHS training, and now, year on year, we're seeing a much higher proportion step out of training and go off and do something else, whether that's go to America or Australia or locum or just take some time out. So now we know that half of doctors, when they get to the end of their second year of training here, they leave NHS training posts, but the majority of them do come back. And it may be that what we're seeing is just a more kind of ad hoc career structure where built into the early years now there's very much an acceptance of the fact that having some time out, getting some experience abroad maybe is not a bad thing to do. You don't have to be hell-bent on climbing the greasy pole to getting your consultant job without looking left and right as you go. So there's that. However, it's undoubtedly the case that morale is very, very low among all doctors at the moment, but especially juniors. And of course, the awful toxic legacy of the junior doctor dispute with the government is partly to do with that. It was very damaging and destructive for morale across the board. The other thing that's, I think, incredibly damaging for morale is feeling as though your voice is being silenced. So if you're trying to speak out and say conditions are really bad, something needs to be done, but your voice is dismissed, it's not heard, people, instead of listening to your concerns, try and pretend they're not real, they don't exist. That's a really easy way to demoralise someone and make them feel that things are hopeless. My cause for optimism is, I think, I don't really have much faith in the government, but I think a lot of the other institutions in the NHS have really listened to young junior doctors since the dispute and have really understood that conditions are very bad on the ground and are actually in many ways really trying to improve them. The fundamental problem is understaffing. Everything follows from that. Your life is just horrible if you're doing two doctors' jobs. It's too hard, you're too overburdened. Everybody recognises that as the fundamental problem now, so that's an improvement compared to maybe 5 years ago. The question is how you go from that recognition to improving staffing levels. And at the end of the day, there is no cost-neutral way of fixing that. It requires money, it requires resources, and it may be that things have to get worse before they get better, that we have to have more patients dying on trolleys until finally, in the end, public and media pressure on the government is so great that they will respond with more funding for the NHS. But I do think that will happen. I do think that the status quo is not going to continue because it can't.
I'm afraid it'll have to be the last question, this one here. And then the green. Oh, that's good. Fine, no, that's you. With the scarf, yeah.
Thanks.
Unless you in the green were trying to ask a question, were you, darling? Oh, fine, okay.
Okay, hi, thanks. I'm Helen. I'm a GP in East London, in Hackney. And I've been a doctor for 11 years. I spent 6 years being a GP in Hackney, and I've now just moved back into A&E, but as a GP, which is a discussion in itself, really.
Yes.
But I suppose what I wanted to say was back to your point about the complete lack of funding in health and social care. Obviously, as GPs, I think we have something like 9% of the budget for health, and there's a huge amount of, most GPs are very demoralised, but also back to your point about the health and social care and housing infrastructure. We're very lucky in Hackney, working with great people, and I think, in a sense, you can just get your head down and do your job every day, as you say, Rachel, and you're doing the best that you can for the patient in front of you. But certainly, as a GP, just the absolute desperation of the knock-on effect of the housing crisis. Previously, when people were being rejected for their employment support allowance, it does become the role of the GP to sort of, can you write a letter for me to try and get me up the housing list because there are 5 people in one room, or the blanket approach for their benefits is that it's cut unless you then have a really good letter from your GP that takes quite some time, and we're happy to do, but just in support of their appeal for ESA. So I guess as a GP I can't stress enough the effect that all of those cuts have had. I mean, yesterday safeguarding reviews for adults, what went wrong, and at the end, there's some great work being done, but it does sometimes come back to how can we make the most of what we're being given, in terms of the top-down problems that we're facing. I don't think anyone has the answers, and I think the GPs leaving, like me, it's a terribly difficult decision to make, and going back into hospital, there are now people that call themselves F4s and F5s, which used to be Foundation 1 and 2, and then you did specialty training, but people, they want to be locums, and you can see why. We're all in support of junior doctors, but you can see the problems that they're facing. And
why did you leave GP?
I mean, I love my job, and I still work in the same area, and it will be a temporary thing, I hope.
Respite care?
For yourself?
For me or for the patients, yeah. It was a really difficult decision, and I've got very young twins myself as well. And I think there's probably a case to be said that every now and again in inner city general practice, you probably need to have a year out, and I love A&E as well. And yeah, I think there's a role for GPs in A&E, unfortunately, at the moment as well. So.
Well, thank you very much. A very helpful and a good note really to end on, because it sort of shows what a holistic system we're discussing. I want on your behalf to thank Dr. Rachel Clarke very warmly for her contribution, and to recommend again Your Life in My Hands, her junior doctor's story. It's a very good read, a pretty shocking one nevertheless, but beautifully done. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.